Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Maya Levy, and today I'm excited to share my senior capstone project, Green Minds Environmental Education as a Catalyst for Eco-Conscious Values. In this presentation, I'll lay out the problem, the study I conducted, the key findings, and most importantly, why they matter for holistic climate action. By the end of this presentation, I hope you'll see that curricular design is not just an academic exercise, it's a frontline climate justice strategy. This work sits at the intersection of pedagogy, public health, and policy. So let's start at the background panel on the left. Environmental education can be defined as any experience that deepens our relationship with land and expands our understanding of Earth and its systems. Environmental ed has also proven to motivate climate action and engage in local spaces. So those learning opportunities are shaped by socio-ecological relationships, which in the United States are heavily influenced by racism and classism. So decades of redlining, intentional defunding, restricted green spaces all create real geographic disparities in who actually gets outside, which translates directly into educational inequities. So, mainstream programs often ignore local histories, indigenous stories, and cultural identities, leaving marginalized communities disconnected from both their land and climate solutions, making them unproductive. So, when students don't see themselves in the narrative of nature, the message is clear then that environmentalism is not for them, it's for somebody else, which completely erodes any motivation for collective stewardship. So, what we need is environmental education that is place-based, justice-centered, and culturally responsive if we hope to close climate action gaps and to create collective stewardship. So, from that problem statement, I had two guiding questions that supported my research. The first, how does access to environmental education influence students' attitudes or beliefs about the planet and non-human life? So here I wanted to test whether simple exposure, so how often a student gets outside with intention, predicts stronger ecological values. So quantifying attitude scores across different access levels allowed me to isolate frequency as a potential driver of stewardship intent. And so the second question was, can stronger eco-friendly beliefs help bridge the gap between knowledge and real climate action participation? And so this kind of pushes the inquiry from do you care to do you act? So if attitudes alone don't translate into behavior, it signals that educators must utilize a community-oriented practice maybe that could lower these barriers to action. So in other words, belief, of course, is necessary, but it's not sufficient. We need to know what additional elements push conviction into collective change. And so, in answering those questions, this required both field engagement and data collection. And so, during my remote internship with the Collaborative for Socio-Ecological Engagement, or COSE, I supported a public-facing environmental ed program in which my main deliverable was creating an educational toolkit which summarized their foundational literature. And so this partnership really grounded my project in a real-world setting, to help ensure my findings that would be able to be directly applicable to the practitioners who actually are serving these diverse communities of students. And so, in answering my research questions, I used a mixed methods approach. First, I conducted a 14-day survey and distributed it to about 63 UW undergraduates, which captured their experiences with environmental education, as well as their self-rated eco-conscious attitudes, as well as any barriers they may have faced to that environmental ed. And second, I utilized a literature review of 12 academic papers, which provided context on place-based learning, cultural responsive pedagogy, and critical pedagogy of place, which using these two methods combined primary data with peer-reviewed insights, which offered my project both breadth and depth. And so key variables included frequency of environmental education, self-rated, attitude scores, reported barriers, and qualitative reflections on their connections to land. So this takes us to our results. So the bar chart in Figure 1 shows that students who experienced environmental education weekly reported the highest eco-conscious attitude score, about a 4.4 out of 5. So this tells us that frequency does matter. Regular exposure strengthens pro-environmental attitudes. Statistically, the weekly group outperformed the monthly and quarterly groups by nearly half a point, which isn't significant though. So this tells us that it isn't purely linear. Scores remained high, even with infrequent access to environmental ed, which tells us that accessibility is not the sole driver alone of eco-conscious attitudes. It's also quality and cultural relevance of the content that matter. And so this plateau suggests a kind of ceiling effect. So once baseline curiosity is sparked, depth and context, not just repetition, push learning further. So that takes me to our second point, that cultural relevant education is powerful. So peer-reviewed work like the Learning in Places, educational frameworks, as well as the critical pedagogy of place by Grunwald 2003, as well as other literature from my review, confirmed that embedding local culture and justice amplifies identity, empowerment, and long-term stewardship, especially for historically excluded learners, which is my space of curiosity. And so, additionally, from my survey, I found that over 27% of students named lack of culturally relevant information as their top barrier to learn environmental learning in their childhood. So finally, there seems to be a growing desire in students to heal their relationships with the land. Open-ended responses were powerful. As students wrote, I want to be more a part of nature than I am right now. I wish I made more sustainable choices. And so these statements of many revealed an untapped well of motivation that justice-centered education can channel into collective action. So psychologists describe this as environmental self-identity. Where people see ecological care as part of who they are. And so I think my data suggests that identity is present here, but it's just undernourished. And so filling that gap could convert this passive concern into something more concrete, um, which takes us to broader significance, where I've distilled three major implications from this project. The first is the opportunity for an equitable climate leadership pipeline. So, when marginalized students see their histories and identities reflected in lessons, they shift from underlying concern to active engagement. So, inclusive ed models support a more diverse movement of scientists, lawyers, and organizers, people who can push policy forward from within. Equity here isn't just moral, but it's also strategic. Diverse leadership embeds equity in every decision, steering scientific agendas and public policies towards solutions that uplift marginalized communities and distribute benefits more fairly across society. Implication two, community-rooted resilience. Place-based learning builds collective efficacy. And so this means that frontline neighborhoods, often those most exposed to climate risk, are better positioned to design and lead adaptation projects. So from urban greening to disaster planning, communities can exercise their agency to directly reduce environmental health disparities. Research actually shows that communities with higher collective efficacy recover faster from climate shocks. And so justice-centered environmental ed then functions as climate adaptation infrastructure. And so finally, implication three, an opportunity to center indigenous traditional ecological knowledge. Elevating traditional ecological knowledge affirms indigenous sovereignty and brings time-tested stewardship practices into mainstream curricula. So not only does this support in repairing historical erasure of indigenous knowledge systems and identities, but it also equips all students with place-specific strategy for climate resilience. Indigenous fire management techniques, for example, are actually now informing California wildfire policy, showing us that traditional ecological knowledge truly is nothing but cutting-edge science. So, taken together, these implications show that reimagined environmental education is not a side project, but a scalable pathway to align climate goals with social justice. To close, Green Minds demonstrates that frequency, cultural relevance, and emotional connection are the pillars of effective environmental education. If we invest in justice-centered, place-based programs that honor Indigenous knowledge and reflect the lived experiences of our learners, we can turn awareness into belonging, into collective stewardship. And this sequence dismantles the historical gatekeeping of the environmental movement and invites every community member into climate leadership. Thank you so much for your time. Please feel free to reach out if you have any questions.